I'd like to pass over to Kath now to start the meeting. Our President, Kath.
Thanks very much. It's lovely to see people from other parts of Wirral and Liverpool. It really is. I did ask Lionel for a kind of a brief introduction to his talk, and as you know, it's about his uncle, Group Captain Guy Bolland, CBE. I'll hand over to you, Lionel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Kath, and welcome everybody. Guy Bolland was my father's nearest brother, and whilst my parents were in Africa, he was my childhood guardian, and apart from my mother and father, the person who's had the most profound and beneficial effect upon me, and to whom I shall always remain deeply grateful, and I was honoured to have known him. All his life, he took on the establishment, and he stood for what he thought was right, often with consequences, as you will hear. He had a distinguished military career, and on this particular day, I'm delighted and very proud to share with you some of his story. At 16, Guy first joined the Royal Mail Line, and in the 4 years he was with the company, he sailed all over the world, and he obtained his second mate's ticket. Now, the RAF was particularly keen to recruit people with experience of navigation, which of course Guy had. And so at 20 years of age, he was welcomed into the RAF as a pilot officer. He was truly mesmerized by the thought of being able to take to the skies and the kind of freedom that it would offer. He absolutely loved flying from the very start, and he trained in a Hawker Tomtit, as shown here. Now, flying in those days was a bit basic, and in this picture you can see a thing called a Hux starter, and the top of this contraption, this long probe sticking out, would hook into the propeller of one of the old string bags that was typical of the day, and it would crank the engine round until it fired. And that's how a lot of these old aircraft actually got going. In 1932, he did a spell in Iraq flying Wapitis, as shown here. And after that, he did a further spell at Netheravon, which was the central flying school where he took the instructor's course and became a flying instructor. He had a natural aptitude for this, and I can recall from childhood how skillful he was at instructing. He had a way of it. But even when being admonished, and unfortunately that was fairly frequent in my case, one always sensed that there was a lesson to learn at the end of it. In 1937, Guy was sent to Manston as one of the early ones to attend a new RAF navigation school. Now, navigation was a big thing in those days, and most pilots weren't properly trained or simply couldn't navigate. In his memoirs, Guy refers to the Butt report of bombing in 1941, where in August of that year, only 1/3 of bombers got within 5 miles of their target, and in the Ruhr, with its industrial haze, it was 1/10. Astonishing. Now, because of his naval experience and his navigational aptitude, he found himself in 210 Squadron flying Supermarine Stranraers at Calshot. Now, these lovely planes were designed by Mitchell, the designer of the fabulous Spitfire. And at one point, although they didn't know it until much later, they were actually guinea pigs for the early development of radar. And the equipment was used to try and detect these planes coming back over the sea. In 1940, he was promoted to squadron leader and posted to a coastal command squadron here at Hooton on the Wirral. This was the old Cheshire racecourse, and on Guy's arrival, it still had a grandstand, and this was used as a control tower. Now, light aircraft from the Aero Club were also stored there, One day, an employee started up an engine which spectacularly backfired and set the whole place on fire, including Guy's uninsured motor car that was parked within it. The whole lot went up and was completely destroyed. Now, there was also an unofficial black market established between the squadron and the Leverhulme family, of course, in Port Sunlight. Now, one of the family was a WAF, and soap from the factory was going to the squadron, so they're a very clean bunch of boys, and that was exchanged for ammunition, which through the family went to the Home Guard in Port Sunlight. I've been musing about who that WAF might have been, and in my view, it was the last Viscount Philip Leverhulme's younger sister, Rosemary, and at this time, she would have been about 21. Now at Hooton, they flew Ansons and tiger moths. Guy describes the Anson as quite useless in any active wartime role except for limited anti-submarine patrol. He says they could barely mount an attack on a submarine. Invariably, they could only alert Bomber Command or the Navy. And they were also powerless, of course, to assist with any of the defence of Liverpool, which at the time was enduring terrible bombing. And their vantage point from Houghton Airfield must have been only too awful because they could see everything. In August 1940, he was posted to command 217 Squadron at St Evell in Cornwall, and the squadron was also equipped with Ansons. Instead of any light work, they were given a bombing role, and Brest Harbour was their only target. Now the Anson carried 120-pound anti-submarine bombs, and Guy wrote he doubted that they would have even broken a porthole if by a 1,000 to 1 chance they were to hit any of the ships that happened to be there. Now, Brest Harbour was vigorously defended by the Germans, and consequently losses were very considerable, even when the raids were at night. Just imagine, this is the sight that a pilot would have seen trying to deliver his ordnance over Brest Harbour. The squadron had their Ansons fitted with Vickers guns to fire out of the sides in case of attack by fighter planes. But when Guy's HQ at Plymouth discovered this, they frowned upon it as an unauthorised modification and ordered their removal. Guy writes in his memoirs, "I did not obey this order. He saw he was putting his aircrew at risk, and in his view, without the possibility of achieving any military success, the least that could be done was to give his men some chance, albeit a very small one, of fighting back." Guy recalls that later in the war, this addition was commonplace, and he writes, "Perhaps winning mattered more then." Now things came to a head in March 1941 when Guy was ordered to make a daylight attack on the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper in Brest Harbour. The Navy had insisted that the RAF do something about it. Night raids saw considerable losses, and a daylight raid would be far, far worse. Guy knew that this was a suicide mission, and he didn't expect to see any of his men again. He declared that his aircraft were unserviceable. An argument naturally ensued with his area officer commanding, and Guy was directly ordered to put some aircraft in the air. By then, the squadron had also got some Bristol Beauforts, which were torpedo bombers, and he eventually made 3 of them available. And he declared that if his worst fears turned out to be the case, he would go to Plymouth to complain. Now, Beauforts had a crew of 4. All 3 aircraft were lost, with only 1 airman surviving. Against direct orders not to, Guy went to Plymouth to see the area officer commanding and the Admiral. A furious row ensued, which cost Guy his command. And the following day, he was posted to C&C Home Fleet as their fleet aviation officer, FAVO as it was called. And as FAVO, he had no specific duties to perform. And there was great tension between the RAF and the Royal Navy. The rivalry between the services was all too clear, and he found himself right in the middle of it. He found this constant battle most uncomfortable, and several times in his memoirs he attacks the arrogance of senior officers who wrangled with each other in the face of serious adversity. His boredom, however, and sense of uselessness completely disappeared on the 23rd of May 1941, when HMS King George V and others set sail to tackle the Bismarck, with Guy on board as in the role of FAVO. Now, Guy is delighted to say that it was an RAF Catalina that first spotted Bismarck, but the crew had been in the air for 26 hours. The exhausted aircrew gave Bismarck's permission in error, 35 miles wrong. Ark Royal was part of this fleet that had been dispatched, and it launched 15 swordfish. Now, unfortunately, they found HMS Sheffield, and she was attacked by mistake, but luckily with no hits. But these crew were courageous. Now, at the time of this battle, you have to bear in mind just how bad the weather was. The waves, for example, at sea were 50 foot high. It was dreadful. These swordfish returned to Ark Royal. They rearmed, they launched again, and the second attack against Bismarck was one of the most courageous that you could imagine, and eventually caused Bismarck's rudder to be damaged. Now, this enabled HMS Rodney and HMS King George V to open fire. Guy watched this battle from the lower bridge of King George V. He saw Bismarck actually straddle HMS Rodney with shells, thankfully no hits. And eventually, as the battle continued, Bismarck's armament was virtually completely destroyed. The ship was a virtual floating wreck. It had no capacity to return any fire, but even at that point, it still had to be sunk by torpedoes. And the ship went down without ever striking our colours. In December 1941, Guy was promoted to acting group captain, and he was sent to Gibraltar to take over one of the senior posts. In September 1942, he then took command of Gibraltar's North Front airfield as group captain. North Front was a critical staging point in the relief of Malta and was to be the key to Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Malta's eventual and very close run relief enabled the island's aircraft, mostly provided via Gibraltar, to cause havoc to Rommel's supply chain. Now, in 1941, the airfield was too short. As you can see in this picture, it didn't extend out into the water at all. It was too short for its current activity, let alone the sort of aircraft that would be required for Operation Torch. It was to be extended initially from 900 to 1100 yards and later to 1600 yards. And at that time, most large aircraft using Gibraltar were mainly amphibian. It was imperative for Guy to keep the airfield operational while it was being extended by the Royal Engineers. This was no small task. The extension was out into Gibraltar Bay, and the material for it came from tunnelling into the Rock of Gibraltar itself. This turned out to be one of the most notable sapper achievements of the whole of the war. Well over 1 million cubic yards were dug out of the rock. This is comparable to a 10-foot wide railway tube running from Liverpool to London. Within the excavated areas, there was a fully operational hospital established, amongst many other things. Now, North Front was fully operational airfield while construction continued. Eventually, it hosted 2 coastal command squadrons, Spitfire meteorological flight, a Fleet Air Arm squadron, and a continual flow of aircraft from the UK on their way out east. Now, these flights called in at Gibraltar and Malta, and if you couldn't refuel at Gibraltar, basically, you were out of the war. Now, for a young pilot, flying out in a new aircraft and making a first trip over the sea, landing at North Front was a terrifying task. Short of petrol by then, every circuit had to be over the south end of the rock, not over Spain, which of course was neutral. There were also wrecks of aircraft at either end of the runway, which further eroded the confidence of these young pilots. And to cap it all, the wind at either end of the rock sheared violently, often in different directions. Construction of the extension went on all the time. It had to. It was only curtailed to accommodate the arrival or departure of aircraft. Reinforcement aircraft would leave the United Kingdom at first light, arriving at Gibraltar in the evening. There could be 20 of them in a circuit around Gibraltar, probably flown by these nervous young pilots, and by then all very, very short of fuel. If a plane crashed on landing, it couldn't be moved easily. Guy writes, "I regret to say that I ordered the aircraft to be pushed into the sea by bulldozer. Had I not, as a matter of policy, decided on this action, I might on one evening have lost many machines, either through fuel shortage or through the increased anxiety of pilots still airborne." These problems couldn't be understated. There were severe winds, as we've said, around the rock, traffic and workers crossing the runway every day, as they still do even today. And all this watched by senior staff officers, including General Eisenhower himself, who personally witnessed several of these crashes. Montgomery heard what Guy was doing, and without understanding the circumstances, complained to the Air Ministry that there was a madman called Bolland at Gibraltar who was bulldozing new aircraft into the water without any attempt at salvage. He wanted Guy removed immediately. Eisenhower knew exactly what was going on. He intervened, and Guy heard no more from Montgomery. Guy was awarded the CBE, and he has always maintained that this was on Eisenhower's recommendation. It was presented to him in June 1943 at Buckingham Palace by King George VI. Guy was aged only 33. Now, the Germans had always had plans to capture the rock. They had prepared Operation Felix. The conquest of the rock was to be led by one of Germany's leading mountain warfare commanders, General Ludwig Küdler. His force included the elite Großdeutschland Regiment, along with elements of the German 1st Mountain Division, 3 engineered battalions, and a detachment of commandos from the Brandenburg Regiment, who would also take part. The entire corps was to be supported by 26 battalions of artillery, as well as 2 dive bomber wings and fighter escorts. The invasion force was to cross the Pyrenees and sweep into Spain, driving southwest to Gibraltar. It never happened. Franco never gave his consent. The Germans wouldn't have allowed that to stop them, but of course the Russian front did, and that became their first priority, and beyond that things went for them bad to worst. In addition, the logistical issues in Spain were significant in themselves. Spanish bridges, it was doubtful that they would have the strength to withstand the military might that was going to cross them. And also there were different railway gauges between France and Spain. You can't talk about Gibraltar without mentioning the Sikorsky incident. Now, for Polish people fighting in the war, General Sikorsky really was Poland, and it was extremely tough for them to accept his death. And theories that he was assassinated abounded, many suggesting that Churchill and Stalin were behind it. And there were severe tensions between Russia and Poland. Sikorsky was outspoken. Often what he said was extremely inconvenient, although privately probably admired. In June 1943, both Sikorsky and the Russian ambassador Ivan Maysky ended up being accommodated at Gibraltar at the same time. But they were kept firmly apart as both nations have broken off diplomatic relations. Guy had to make sure that they never met, never learned of the other's presence, or that they were both due to fly out the following day, albeit to different destinations. Guy had the army guard Sikorsky's aircraft the night before his departure, and even had an airman sleep on it. He was sure that no one went on the aircraft. However, later, a postal service claimed that they had and deposited postbags on it. Following evening, the governor, the air officer commanding, and Guy said their goodbyes to Sikorsky. His aircraft took off, and very shortly afterwards, it ditched into the sea, killing Sikorsky. Despite all the speculation, even still ongoing today, Guy believed that the pilot, Purcell, who had developed a distinctive flying habit and who was known to look for horizons as soon as he was airborne, with no lights visible at the end of the runway from which he took off, he would have seen no horizon, and he would have lowered his eyes to his cockpit instruments, whilst at the same time, naturally but unwisely, moving the control column forward. And this would have sent his aircraft into the sea. In 1944, Guy was posted to Pembroke Dock. And it's interesting, you've seen flying boats all the way through this, his connection with Coastal Command, and there has always been this sort of quasi-maritime theme to his career. So here he was with 3 squadrons of Sunderlands, and he was also required to take over the Empire flying boats that had been operating from Poole. The waters around Pembroke Dock do have limitations. Pembroke Dock is on Milford Haven, so there's only so much water there. Also, there is the rise and fall of the tide in the Bristol Channel, which is the most significant in the UK and can reach a rise and fall of as much as 14 metres, which is quite huge. So in addition to his 3 squadrons of Sunderlands, he had to take on all the civil flying boats. And Guy's career continued at the end of the war. Firstly, he attended Staff College, and he was then sent on a mission to the Far East on behalf of the Air Ministry. His job was to send home anyone up to and including the rank of Wing Commander who was surplus to requirements. This resulted in Guy becoming extremely unpopular with many air officers commanding, who were living the high life and making no meaningful contribution, and then saw their staff being dramatically reduced. In 1948, Guy was sent to the United States to attend the war course at Maxwell Field in Alabama. And following this, he was posted to Washington to serve as senior intelligence officer to the United States for the British Joint Services under Lord Tedder. He was involved in the early work setting up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this was the early Cold War, and he was also Director of Intelligences, which was a top secret job. He was forbidden from discussing with Lord Tedder the most secret part of his work, which was the early program that eventually produced the U-2 spy plane. Well, this made things even worse with Tedder, who considered him lazy, mainly because he didn't know what Guy was doing. Guy points out, however, that the U-2 program was a CIA thing and not a United States Air Force one. In 1956, after a posting to RAF Ballykelly in Northern Ireland, Guy returned to Washington, but this time as Chief Intelligence Officer. But even in 1999, when Guy was writing his memoirs, he couldn't write as freely as he would have wished. However, this was still the Cold War, and it was really heating up, excuse the pun. The increasing international tensions pushed forward the development of reconnaissance, long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Russian radar was effective, but only up to about 45,000 feet. So if aircraft could fly well above that, it would be possible to overfly without serious incident. The Russians knew something was up there, and it was only a matter of time for their technology to improve. The RAF secretly acquired 4 RB-45C strategic reconnaissance aircraft. They were never on the official RAF inventory, although they were painted in RAF colours. However, this meant that the United States could completely deny any knowledge of them. And then they started to fly the U-2, and it could attain a height of 65,000 feet. So it flew over Soviet airspace with impunity. Its wheels were jettisoned on takeoff, and the aircraft had what were virtually bicycle wheels underneath the fuselage, which it used to land again. But because of it, accidents were quite common. Now, Russian radar got better, and this all spectacularly blew up when the Russians brought down a U-2 with a SAM missile and captured the pilot, Gary Powers. And of course, there followed the most huge propaganda stink. U-2s and their successors continued to fly, however, but a bit more cautiously. Even so, no fewer than 6 failed to return. And if you include all the other strategic reconnaissance aircraft missions that were flown all over the world, over 200 airmen were lost. Guy retired from the Air Force in 1959 and fully retired in 1973. The RAF was never far from his mind. He flew a Chipmunk trainer on his 80th birthday. He was heavily involved with this local air training corps squadron in Woking all the way through his retirement. He was a man who'd fought battles for others all through his career, freely admitting that it probably hindered his progression. But he was true to his conscience, and he did what he thought was right. Even in retirement, he battled with the Ministry of Defence over widows' pensions, Woking Council and many others who obstinately stood in the way of reason. For his children and me, as one of his nephews, he was a wonderful man, a source of great inspiration. Thank you for listening.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thanks again, Lionel. It was really good, and the visuals were marvellous as usual. He is a really good speaker, Lionel. We'll hire him out at a huge fee to anybody who wants him. You know. I would like to hand over to our Rotarian Tom, ex-serviceman, who will read the exhortation, followed by the Kohima epitaph. Tom, can I?
Thank you. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. at the going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them.
We remember them.
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. Thank you.
And thank you, Tom, very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks a lot. It only remains for me to thank you all for coming. Au revoir.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lionel.
Thanks,
Absolutely
Lionel.
brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Lionel.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Very
Lionel.
welcome.
Brilliant.
Very interesting.